Hello, everybody. I'm Jack Carey, your host, and welcome back to Paranormal Planet. Got a really cool show for you guys tonight, and really interesting information to share with you guys on a crash retrieval, UFO crash retrieval that I thought would be interesting for us to kind of analyze in light of the findings from the OSAP program that I've been talking about over a number of shows. So make sure and come by to paraintelagency.com and take a look at the special reports that I put up over there. They'll have information and insight that you won't get anywhere else, and they're pretty in depth. So help support the channel and go check out the website. And so we've been talking about the OSAP program, really the culmination of their findings while they were in operation. They're not anymore, but they did get 22 million in funding at the time. And Dr. Holm Kelleher, who was the lead scientist for Bigelow's original NIDS group, the National Institute for Discovery Science, on Skinwalker Ranch. He was also the chief scientist there. And he, of course, put out a book called Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, and he was co-author of Hunt for the Skinwalker. And their findings, as I've discussed, is that, or the most interesting thing, is that what they call the hitchhiker effect. And this hitchhiker effect is what they describe as a wide array of paranormal activity that would follow people home who were a part of that program or who had had close encounters with these craft, who had seen them, etc. In one particular interesting case that they highlight, one of these individuals was a high-ranking CIA officer known only as Axelrod, and he had some really profound paranormal things occur at his house. So all of this really, in my mind, kind of comes around and sort of originates at Skinwalker Ranch. And their findings, really at the end of the NIDS, stint at the ranch, was that they could determine one thing, and that's that they were interacting with a non-human conscious intelligence. So keep that in mind as we go along. And I've got a surprise photo for you guys here at the end of the show in relation to that. So this hitchhiker effect is something that they've keyed in on, and they've even gone so far as to make the statement that until they can understand the wide array of paranormal activity associated with the UFO phenomenon, then they're not going to be able to understand the totality of the UFO phenomenon itself. And that's quite a statement. Coming from Colm Kelleher and from Dr. Gary Nolan, who is a prominent scientist who figures into this. He's employed at Stanford, and he's utilized by the U.S. government for a number of different things. He's one of the smartest people on the planet, and he was tasked with studying some of the physical effects that were being recorded as happening to people who had had these close encounters. Some of them had been military personnel who had taken that footage. Others were just cases that they had inside knowledge of and were able to study some of these people. In one of the cases, they were actually able to follow the subject over a long period of time, which gave them a ton of information. And what they all had in common was a profound amount of brain damage. and they described it as profound. And it's very much like the Havana syndrome that's being talked about now openly. The interesting thing about the Havana syndrome is that there is at least one case of a American agent in Cuba who was targeted, and in that particular case, he saw the assailants and he was able to see them drive away. They were using some sort of mechanism that emits microwaves. That's what they believe. Sorry, that's my vicious labradoodle. So, interestingly, I think it's important to point out a lot of Gary Nolan's findings as before we kind of delve into the deeper part of all of this. And this is going to be a bit of a lengthier show probably than I have had in quite a while. So Dr. Nolan, I discovered, and I found it very interesting that when he was a child, 10 years old, he and a friend of his had a UFO experience where he described a craft flying right overhead, treetop level, silent, no propulsion. And that's very interesting considering where he is now. And I'll mention yet another case of that later on. Turns out Jacques Vallée also had an experience with a UFO and his whole family when he was a child. And lo and behold, look where he is. Are we looking at some sort of pushing along of these people who eventually pursued the subject to where we are at this time and have made some pretty profound discoveries, especially in the last couple of years. So Nolan is wondering from a pharmaceutical viewpoint whether or not this hitchhiker effect, and this all goes back to the idea of this brain damage, but whether or not this hitchhiker effect can be combated in some way through a drug that they could develop. In other words, would they be able to study enough people over time that they could zero in on the exact part of the brain that this was occurring in initially, and then develop an inhibitor of some kind, etc. It's interesting because one of the other scientists that the government turns to time and again, a man named Kit Green, examined a lot of these cases. And in his report, he stated that it didn't look to him like anything more than what he was seeing in supposed cases of Havana syndrome. So they're that much alike. The fact that one of these agents saw the perpetrators who were clearly human is one of those weird things. So one of those weird things that just kind of we have an open question about. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Nolan says that the so-called Jason Society, which, if you don't know, is a group of scientists that the government has, they're a private group, but the government turns to this group of the world's best scientists, they're called the Jason Society, to delve into various problems that they're having. And they determined that about 10 to 15% of the cases that had overall that had been studied did not fit Havana syndrome. So that's interesting. There is out there something known as the Galileo Project, and I mention that because they're studying currently the societal implications of full disclosure. And that's something that, the power structure will always take very, very, seriously, because if you upset people's ways of thinking, if you upset their belief system, etc., then you kind of you see all through history where societies have collapsed because of such things occurring. And, Stephen Hawking, by the way, warned against any contact with an alien species, no matter who they were or how beneficial they appeared to be. It would be the end of the human race. So Nolan is kind of spearheading, or has kind of developed this really interesting idea that what these things might be, what UFOs might be, and even some of the ETs and strange anomalous lights that may not be actual physical craft, etc., kind of fits into the holographic universe theory idea that I covered a couple of shows ago, primarily for this reason. And he's of the opinion that they could possibly be projections which appear to us as real in the material sense. So it's very much like scientists, physicists think that our reality is actually on a 2D surface, and it's being, there's something projecting a image onto this 2D surface, which is information basically. And it's sort of, that's how the whole holographic image theory really works. And his idea is that it's quite possible that the functionality of the things that we're seeing aren't even supposed to be occurring in this particular dimension. In other words, whatever it is that's projecting these things or moving them around is doing so to achieve an effect in their reality construct, and it's bleeding through and showing up in ours. That's a whole different way of thinking about it. But because they're 99.9% sure that there's other dimensions, this kind of way of thinking is kind of where they're headed as a whole with OSAP. So it's interesting because he makes an example in that you have a flat sheet of paper and you have an ant on the flat sheet of paper, and the ant is us, and the flat sheet of paper is our reality. And somebody sets a plastic cup of water on top of the sheet of paper. You have no concept of what that cup is, what it's used for, or its propulsion system, which was the hand that put it there. And all you can see from your reality viewpoint is the merger of the point where the plastic is hitting the paper. All of that other stuff is unknown to you, and the whole functionality of why it's occurring is unknown to you too. You're just seeing the effect of it here. So that's a really crazy way of thinking. And that's how our physicists are thinking these days when they look at some of this activity, because this is where their equations lead them. So now, it's interesting because I wanted to get into, now that I've kind of gone back over the hitchhiker effect and where the OSAP guys are and kind of where they're headed insofar as their overall thinking and analysis of the plan. Sorry for the reflection on the glasses all the time. But it's interesting that Jacques Vallée, of all people, the famous Jacques Vallée, authored a book recently called Trinity. And it's about a crash that occurred at the Trinity testing site of an atomic bomb. And he points out that it appears like this phenomenon has some sort of like control function. And this control function, when it appears, causes a reaction. And that reaction has been calculated by the intelligence causing it. In other words, like, you can look at sort of like the 1890s airship phenomenon, where people were reporting flying machines that to us would have been, we call a blimp with a ship attached to it, and all kinds of moving parts and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden, man invented a blimp and began to fly and all of those things. It's like that. It's like a control mechanism that sort of pushes you in a direction. And you can see that even today, kind of in where our technology is. Now, it's clear that some of the technology that we have today came from crashed alien craft, and I'll be getting into a little bit of that too. So let's talk about this case, because this case is a perfect case for us to sort of juxtapose to the OSAP findings, OSAP stuff, and make some inferences about. So first of all, let's get a context for when this happened, because most people have never heard of the Trinity crash. They've heard of Roswell. The more, I guess, well-versed people out there will know that Cape Girardeau, Missouri occurred before Roswell, and was widely considered to be really the first recovered craft. However, Trinity occurred 2 years before Roswell and a year before Cape Girardeau in 1945. And it had 3 eyewitnesses to the crash, something that the other 2 incidents do not have. The eyewitnesses in this particular case were 2 young Hispanic boys. Now, this was during the war. All of the men were off to war. This was in rural areas, very often the case that the children had to grow up fast. They were tasked with taking care of cattle, tasked with driving, trucks and stuff like that around the property, and were very, astute for that age compared to what we have today. And on top of that, one of the eyewitnesses, Jose Padilla is his name, his father also witnessed the craft. And on top of that, an Air Force pilot who was in the air at the time witnessed the craft crash. And on top of that, now they've discovered yet another eyewitness who was a young girl at the time, and her name was Sabrina, and her family was on the very, very edge of where this thing happened. And she recounts how she snuck out one night and went to see the crash site. And I'll get to more of her testimony too. So in that context, also realize that this was at a time when we didn't even have an Air Force per se. There was no actual Air Force. There were Army pilots, but there was no Air Force at that time. So the Army actually ended up going and retrieving this craft. Now, it's very important to make the point that this is the very first crash, and it occurred in a place called San Antonio, New Mexico, not Texas, and it occurred exactly 20 miles from the Trinity atomic bomb test. Now, scientists will tell you it's got the word test on it, but they disagree that it was a test, because in a test you normally conduct a little small something, to prove the theory correct. And these guys dropped a biggest bomb they could possibly make at the time. And it was so big that it didn't actually burn all of the radioactive particles up, and those rained down on the countryside for quite a few days. But that's a very important point. All of these craft, even today, And what initially got modern day disclosure going in the form of Harry Reid and his elbowing the other senators to get it done was the fact that these things had gone over our nuclear facilities and turned off our missiles. In one case, they actually initiated a launch sequence to launch a missile, and that horrified, obviously, the powers that be. And that's what got the ball rolling, really, on all of the stuff that you're seeing and hearing now. So, this nuclear connection, it's something that I want us to focus on because there's a lot of idea behind, or a lot of people, thinking the idea that it's possible that these things are interdimensional. And we have an FBI memo that I've gone over with you guys on the show before, talking about how the nuclear testing actually damaged something in another dimension, a place where these beings were living, and provided them with a doorway with which to come into this dimension. It literally tore the fabric, which is an electromagnetic membrane, between two dimensions so strongly that this was able to take place. Now, there's a whole other aspect to that for those of you who have seen my NASA's Occult Secret film. Also, at this very same time, there was a man named Jack Parsons. He founded JPL Laboratories, that became NASA, and there's a very dark occult secret behind the formation of all of that, which you can see on that film. Now, those guys also claim to have opened an interdimensional doorway and saw something come through it. So keep that in mind. And so this crash. Oh yeah, I did want to mention one thing. So the Cape Girardeau case, and this is before Trinity was discovered and all of this information came out. Cape Girardeau was considered to be the very first crash retrieval, and it's interesting because it's the Cape Girardeau case that part of Blue Book went to officially investigate, and it was during that investigation that they reported that the eyewitnesses saw a Sasquatch at the scene with the craft. That's just the facts, and you can go look it up. It's part of the reason why I formulated the theory in my book, Bigfoot Unleashed, that I formulated with the Chimera. So this crash is really interesting. This craft hits a communication tower. That seems odd to all of us because if they're so advanced, how do they make a mistake like that? How does the Roswell craft crash? How do they crash, period, if they're so advanced? But that's the fact of the case. It hit this communication tower that sent it spinning off. Jacques Vallée says that because of the eyewitnesses' testimony and how they had, seen how long this thing had actually gone when it hit the ground, how far it had skidded along, making this huge trench. He estimated that the thing was probably anywhere from 5 to 7 tons, is what he says. There was some material that was ejected from the craft, but it was minor. And he points out that this craft had to have had amazing integrity, strength to maintain its form. It was egg-shaped with a slightly bubbled compartment on top. And the two boys witnessed the entire crash. And they've got binoculars and they've got a truck. And so they drive as close as they dare to get, and they're looking through their binoculars. And there's a gigantic gash in the side of the craft where you can see through to the interior. And this is where things get a little hair-raising. But they described that the aliens were breathing our air. That's a very important point to make in all of this. How does an alien species evolve so that they can breathe our air? Wouldn't that do something? They did not have any sort of helmet or breathing apparatus on. They only described a tight-fitting uniform. And darkly enough, they were running around in a panic inside the craft. And one of them was screaming. And the two witnesses that are old men now, they're in their 70s and 80s, describe the screams as sounding like a rabbit when you're trying to kill it. And if you've ever heard what a rabbit sounds like when it's being killed, it is blood curdling. So that's something else really important to point out. You know, there's a lot of researchers, including myself, that have come across a lot of evidence that, like the Greys, for example, appear to be a biological robot, which is, you know, designed in clone-like fashion and then programmed with its DNA to perform a very specific function. Here, it looks like something else. These creatures, because they're exhibiting the emotional response that they are, appear to be something far more sentient. The boys described them as looking small. They thought they were small men, but they also described them as bug-like. So, you know, a gray is basically what they described. One idea is that perhaps they popped in interdimensionally right at the point where that communication tower was, and that's why they got hit. So one other really strange detail that these eyewitnesses report is that these creatures didn't walk. They seemed to float or shuffle or will themselves into a different space. That's something that two kids from 1945, New Mexico, who didn't even own a radio, are hard-pressed to come up with by themselves. Again, this was even before the Air Force was formed. And this is one other really odd thing that Ballet came across. The dimensional shape of the craft, which he was able to ascertain because the eyewitnesses who Padilla's father, Jose Padilla's father, the Army actually came and asked him to remove part of their fencing. It was 30 feet, so he knew this thing was 30 feet wide. They told the father it was a weather balloon. Interesting that they used that same excuse, but they needed heavy machinery to get it. Mr. Padilla recounted how the Army actually made their own road to the device to remove it rather than take existing roads. And they removed it in the middle of night in New Mexico, where, if you've ever been there, the street lights do not exist. So, all of that's very, very interesting. And so, when you look at the OSAP program, and then you look at this crash, and there's more, because these guys entered the craft. This craft sat there for 8-9 days, they said, while the Army tried to get it up and out of there. Of course, the beings were gone after the first day that they arrived, but the craft sat there. And it wasn't until the third day that Mr. Padilla entered that craft with a state policeman. Not long after that, he went back to the craft, and he had his kid with him, who was one of the eyewitnesses, is Jose Padilla. And Jose Padilla went into the craft, and he wrenched something off of the wall. It's described as a bracket. It's described as a lever. It's in the possession of Jacques Vallée, and it's being studied under laboratory conditions. on a isotope scale, he says. So the interesting thing about this lever is that it's so oddly human-like. It looks like it was human-made. The problem with that is that there's no manufacturing mark on it, and that simply did not occur. Any company that was making like products like that put a little stamp on it so that the product could be traced back to the manufacturer. These things were sold to military, etc. And this thing did not have that on it, which is really weird. A rudimentary, archaic, by their standards, kind of a tool inside this craft. The craft was described as having a flat floor on it. It was tilted on its side, so when the Army moved it, so they were able to see the bottom, and the bottom did not appear to have any sort of propulsion at all. There was nothing there at all. Padilla and Baca, who was the other eyewitness, Remy Baca was his name, say largely the same thing that Bob Lazar said all those many years ago, that this craft it didn't have any seams, no rivets, no bolts. It looked like it had been molded out of a single piece of material. Now, on top of that, we have the other little girl, and she also went to this crash site at night, and she collected what she and her siblings ended up calling angel hair. Now, she describes this as being a tuft, of material that looked like blonde hair that had tinges of purple and red in it. The material glowed in the dark, and they had it for quite a few years and played with it for quite a few years. They stated that this stuff was all over the place. That so-called angel's hair has been reported in other UFO cases, if you look it up. Lee Corso, who wrote The Day After Roswell, claims that he also was given some of this material, and he never really understood what it was, but thought that it may have something to do with fiber optics. However, fiber optics, most people don't know, had already been invented at that time, and French resistance actually was using fiber optics to communicate with one another. So it didn't lead to the invention of fiber optics, but he never really understood it. And he did report it in his book, The Day After Roswell, which has been published for many years now. So another thing is that, I did want to mention one thing before I go on here. There's one other program that's being initiated by a private scientist named Kevin Newth, and they're using special cameras in Washington State on a long-running basis to record everything in the sky. And he claims that they have filmed a number of what they call UAPs or UFOs. One of them was following a commercial jet. That's a little creepy. The other thing to mention is that they were minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Normally a craft is hot. These things are beyond freezing cold. Should be noted that if you have a superconducting material and you freeze it to near absolute zero, it will exhibit anti-gravitic effects. In that light, Valet makes a couple of observations. IBM, Battelle, and a number of other companies were given material by Colonel Corso at the behest of the intelligence apparatus, and there are scientists who are still alive today talking about how they saw this amazing material. So the fact that this craft appeared at the atomic bomb testing site and crashed at Trinity, that really has to become our first principle thinking when investigating, developed by the philosopher Boscovich. The idea is you come up with one thing that cannot be denied, originating from the very source of a subject, and then you pin everything else against that. What we know for a fact is the very first crash that we can trace occurred right at the Trinity atomic bomb testing site. Roswell happened at the 509th, air wing, which at the time was the only one that had nuclear weapons. You have our modern day senators pointing out the nonstop activity around our nuclear installations and naval ships. And so I think it's very important to zero in on the nuclear aspect of this phenomenon and the idea that it was somehow in the splitting of the atom that this tear was able to take place and this intelligence make it through. That's kind of where I'm leading with this. Now, Vallée and Nolan both point out something that is hard for us to grasp as human beings, but physics proves it out. That it's quite possible, like if this were being projected, that whatever is projecting these things projects something that appears to us as completely material in our reality. However, it's a momentary projection. And this whole nuclear aspect is something that I think that all of this is going to have to go back to, because that is the source origin of the very first activity that we know of. And I've got something interesting at the end here related to some research that I'm doing that pertains to that. So make sure I'm going through all of my information for you guys. Yeah, it's interesting that one of the men who was in charge of the Trinity Trinity testing of the nuclear bomb was Enrico Fermi, who came up with Fermi's paradox, who said, isn't it interesting that aliens are not yet even on our doorstep, and they should be if the Drake equation is correct. And it was he and Oppenheimer that ended up, perhaps ironically, opening a doorway where aliens came through. How strange is that? A few of the details from the eyewitness Sabrina. She handled the angel hair. She says the angel hair gave you shocks, electrical shocks. She described it as pinkish blonde color with purple, and it would glow at night. She described it as looking like a lock of hair, hence the name she gave it as a child. She also her uncle maintained strips, entire strips of this memory metal, the same that was reported at Roswell by Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer. And she recounts the same thing. They would bring it out, they would crinkle it up as much as possible, and she said it would go slowly, but it would always come out perfectly to its flat form again. She also said that a panel came off the craft, and this panel would not absorb heat. Her uncle took a blowtorch to it even, and it remained cool. They would leave it out in the New Mexico sun in the summertime, and she used to put it to her face in the middle of the day because of how cool it was. And she stated that once the Army, discovered this area of the crash, that they cleaned it up within a week. And they told her and her family never to speak of it again. The creepy part about that is that she claims that they would show up once a month and that they would come in the back door of their house and just walk in on them and then question them again about if they had talked to anybody, if they found anything, etc. She said that went on for a number of months. They also said, as I stated before, these guys built a road through the family's land to get to the object that was eventually removed. So, a few things that Valet points out, and it's Valet that did the initial investigation on this with another journalist named Paula Harris from Italy, who is a big writer on the subject in Europe. Together, they did an amazing amount of research and chronicled the evidence in such a way that it's very difficult to explain away. But he said the craft was around 30 feet wide. The internal volume of the craft was quite large. It had a flat floor. There were no signs of propulsion, and whatever it was made out of was superior to any sort of material that we could possibly have today. And I find that interesting. Whoops, I'm going to get rid of this one here and show you guys something really fast. Because of an article that I just saw. What was that? All right. NASA invents revolutionary material 1,000 times better than state-of-the-art spaceship alloys. So NASA, and this just came out, NASA's claiming that they just invented a brand new type of material, 1,000 times better than the state-of-the-art spaceship alloys. That's quite remarkable. And who's to say that this yet again isn't the culmination of over time back engineering some of this alien technology, which was clearly had by the US government. Now, something else to point out about this particular case is that later on, after the formation of the Air Force and Project Blue Book, nobody was ever given any information about the case. It was never given to Blue Book. It was never given to the Air Force. It was never given to anybody else. In fact, all of this stuff just disappears into the hands of the U.S. Army. And that's a fact. So that's really interesting. So what do we glean from this first crash? Because clearly it's physical. These beings are physical. That could have popped in from another dimension. You have the holograph theory, etc. But they appeared sentient. They exhibited emotion. Then a kid goes in and he pulls off something that shouldn't even be in a craft like that. Something that's so rudimentary that humans could manufacture it. And there's always that oddness factor with the UFO phenomenon. It's something that Jonathan Keel talked about repeatedly, something that Jacques Vallée talks about repeatedly. There's just always that really odd factor that you just can't quite explain. How is it this kid didn't go in and pull out a piece of material that today we're just in awe of? No, he goes in and pulls out a lever that by their standards would be probably prehistoric. It's just crazy. But those are the facts of the case. And so when you go back to the source of a phenomenon, and in this case the first UFO crash and retrieval, that's always going to tell you something more than all of the others after that. And so when we look at this, it's important that we look at it in light of this whole idea of the hitchhiker effect, the whole idea that it acted like a virus, that it went from people who were studying the phenomenon, took this home with them like a virus. It then spread to their family members and then to their family members' friends, very much like a virus, or as I would argue, very much like an intelligence. And I started off talking about NIDS and the fact that they basically say in the end of all of their research that this is a non-human intelligence of some kind. They don't know if it's interdimensional, alien, co-evolved on this planet. That kind of stuff is all speculation. But I'm going to leave you with a very interesting thing that a lot of people haven't heard about Skinwalker Ranch, or of one particular occurrence. And they haven't brought this up on the show, and I've not seen it in very many places. But if you search enough, you'll come across what occurred. The original team had cameras set up in the communication center. One of these cameras was in a room that had computers in it at the time, like, desktop kind of computers like they had back then. And someone looking at the screen that the camera is transmitting to, overlooking these other computers, notices that one of them is on, which it shouldn't be, and that there's something on the screen. And I thought I would share that with you guys tonight. So let me pull this up. It's something that shocked me when I saw it. So remember, this might be a sentient intelligence, right? This is what was on the screen. And it says, I living. Whatever this creature is, whatever this intelligence is, it's desperate to communicate with us, to let us know that it is a living being. Is this the source of the entire hitchhiker effect, or does the hitchhiker effect not occur outside of that, along with the rest of the UFO phenomenon? In other words, the hitchhiker effect's like a virus. Did the scientists from Skinwalker Ranch carry that virus with them into the OSAP program, which is what they are now seeing, but isn't necessarily related to the rest of the UFO phenomenon? Or is this applying this paranormal stuff really so weird that even this applies to that? And down the rabbit hole we go, guys. Deeper and deeper and deeper. So that's all I got for you tonight. I did want to show you guys one thing here, and that is an article that just came out today. And this is interesting from a cryptozoological point of view, and I wanted to show it because I didn't want to forget to show you guys. So this is actually on a number of different sites out there today. Another species of hominin may still be alive. And this article and all of the others, this is on the Scientist magazine, and all of the others talk about the discovery of the Homo floresiensis hobbit species, the actual, bones and remains that they found, And then the fact that they have over 36 indigenous eyewitnesses that claim to have run into living beings that are these creatures. How weird would it be for our modern science to discover a hominid species of hobbit still living out there in the world? Very, very interesting stuff. So, thanks for being with me tonight, guys. I will see you next Thursday night, and we'll continue with another deep, dark mystery. Till then, you guys be careful out there. The world is crazy.